My son's voice came out of my phone at 11:47 on a Wednesday night, and I dropped it so hard the screen cracked straight across the middle. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking grief does strange things to a man. You're thinking 6'4" old men hear what they want to hear, especially men who've been living alone for 9 years in a house that's too quiet. Maybe you're right. Maybe that's what I would have thought too, before that night. Before the voicemail that came from a number I didn't recognize, from an area code I didn't know, with a voice that said 17 words I have been hearing in my sleep every night since. Hey, I'm trying to reach someone who might know about the cabin on Ridgemont Road. Please call me back. 17 words. A voice that was not quite my son's voice, and was completely my son's voice at the same time. Lower, slower, rougher around the edges. But the cadence, the way he said please with that slight upward lilt, like a question folded inside a request. Danny always talked like that. His mother used to tease him about it. Said he could make a grocery list sound like a poem. My son died on August 14th, 9 years ago. He was 28 years old. The wildfire that took him started in the eastern section of the Great Smoky Mountains, jumped 3 containment lines in 6 hours because of a wind shift nobody predicted. Danny was on a solo hiking trip. 3 days in the backcountry, the kind of trip he took every summer since he was 19. He knew those mountains the way some men know their own living room. He knew every trail, every switchback, every overlook where the morning fog sat in the valleys like something holy. They found his boot, his wallet, a partial identification through what the fire investigator described in the kind of careful language people use when they are trying not to say something too specifically, as skeletal remains consistent with an adult male. They were 92% confident. They told me 92% like it was a number that should give me comfort instead of 8% of hope that would hollow me out for the next decade. I buried what they gave me. I put a stone in the ground next to his mother's grave in Sevierville, Tennessee, and I stood there in August heat and tried to understand that the world no longer contained my son. That was 9 years ago. And then a stranger left a voicemail asking about the cabin on Ridgemont Road. Nobody knows about that cabin. That is not me being dramatic. That is a simple, verifiable fact. My late wife Carol and I bought that parcel of land in 1987, 12 acres up a dirt road in Cock County that wasn't on any real estate listing and barely showed up on county records. We never called it anything publicly. We called it the cabin on Ridgemont Road among ourselves because Ridgemont was the name of the logging road that dead-ended into our property. There was no sign, there was no listing. The deed listed the address as a rural route number that meant nothing to anyone who didn't already know where to look. Danny and I built that cabin together the summer he turned 17. Just the two of us and Carol bringing us sandwiches and lemonade and telling us we were putting the windows in crooked, which we were. We spent 4 summers finishing it. It was the best work of my life, and I don't mean the carpentry, though the carpentry was good. I mean the work of being a father, of watching a boy become a man over the course of a summer, learning to read wood grain and set a level and think 3 steps ahead of the problem in front of you. After Danny died, I didn't go back to the cabin for 2 years. Then I started going every weekend. Sitting on the porch we'd built together, drinking coffee out of the same chipped blue mug Danny always used, talking to him sometimes the way you do when grief has made you comfortable with your own strangeness. I never told anyone about the cabin, not because I was hiding it, because it felt like the last place in the world that was purely ours. No one should have known its name. I stood in my kitchen at 11:47 at night, holding my cracked phone, listening to that voicemail 3 times. 4 times. My heart was doing something I didn't have a word for. Not hope exactly. Not grief. Something in between. Something that felt like standing on a frozen lake and hearing the ice start to shift under your feet and not being able to move in any direction. I called the number back. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. A generic recording, the automated kind that just reads the number back to you. I hung up without leaving a message. My hands were shaking. I sat at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning, not sleeping, not doing anything really, just sitting in the particular silence of a house that used to hold 3 people and now held only 1. I thought about Danny the way I always think about Danny, in sharp, specific images rather than general feelings. The way he'd come into the kitchen in the morning and ruffle my hair like I was the kid and he was the parent. The way he could spend 4 hours sanding a single piece of wood until it felt like warm glass under your palm. The way he laughed, which was too loud for most rooms, which was the best sound I have ever heard. In the morning I called the number again. This time someone picked up. "Hello?" A man's voice. Careful, slightly guarded. "My name is Gerald Holt," I said. "You left me a voicemail last night. About a cabin." A pause. Yeah, I did. I'm sorry to bother you. I found this number in an old notebook, and I thought maybe..." He stopped. "This is going to sound strange." "Tell me anyway," I said. "I don't really know how to explain it. I've been having these flashes. Like memory fragments. Except I can't always tell if they're real or if I'm just..." Another pause. "I've been told there are gaps in my history. Medical gaps, I guess you'd call it. And lately I keep seeing this image of a cabin. Trees all around it. A porch with 2 rocking chairs. And a road that goes nowhere. Just ends in the trees. I found your number written on a piece of paper tucked inside a woodworking notebook I've had for years. I don't know where I got the notebook. I don't know where I got the number. But something kept pushing at me until I called. I had been gripping the edge of the counter with my free hand. I looked down and my knuckles had gone white. "What's your name?" I asked. "Ray," he said. "Ray Larson. I live in Asheville." Asheville, North Carolina. 4 hours from Sevierville. 3.5 hours from the Smoky Mountains where my son disappeared. "Ray," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. "Can we meet in person? I think we need to talk." He agreed more easily than I expected. We settled on a diner in Waynesville, roughly halfway between us, 2 days later at noon. I spent those 2 days doing something I am not proud of, which is oscillating between absolute certainty that this was a cruel coincidence or some kind of scam, and a breathless, terrifying conviction that it was neither. I didn't sleep well. I drove out to the cabin on Ridgemont Road and stood on the porch in the August heat, looking at the 2 rocking chairs Danny and I had made together the last summer before he died, and I said out loud to no one, "I don't know what's happening. I don't know what this is, but I need to find out." A hawk crossed the sky above the tree line. The woods were quiet, the way deep woods are quiet, full of small sounds that add up to silence. I got to the diner in Waynesville 40 minutes early and sat in a corner booth where I could see the door. I ordered coffee and did not drink it. The waitress, a young woman with her hair in a braid and a name tag that said Becca, asked twice if I was ready to order, and I kept telling her I was waiting for someone, which was the most loaded sentence I had said in years. At 12 minutes past noon, the door opened. I want to be careful about how I describe this moment because I have replayed it so many times since that it has taken on a kind of myth quality in my mind, and I want to stay honest. He walked in. He was taller than I remembered Danny being, which I later understood. 9 years in adulthood can change a man's bearing, the way he carries himself, the width of his shoulders. His hair was short, where Danny wore his long, and there was a beard. He was wearing a canvas work shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and his forearms were dusted with fine wood shavings, the way a woodworker's forearms always are. I stood up without deciding to stand up. My body just rose. He saw me rise and hesitated in the doorway for a moment. Then he walked over, and when he got close enough that I could see his face clearly, I felt the ground tilt under me like the world was deciding something. His eyes were Carol's eyes. Exactly. Precisely. With no room for interpretation. The deep-set gray-green that I had looked into for 32 years of marriage, and another 28 years before that, when they belonged to my son. He had the same slight asymmetry to his jaw that Danny had, from a baseball collision at 15 that broke it and healed imperfectly. The same way of standing with his weight shifted slightly right, which Danny had done since a bad ankle sprain at 20 that never fully corrected. "Mr. Holt?" he said. "Gerald?" I managed. "Please, sit down." He slid into the booth across from me, and Becca came by, and he ordered coffee, black, which was how Danny always took it, which I was cataloging every detail even as I was telling myself that cataloging details was not the same as proof that I was a grieving father who had been waiting 9 years for something and might be building architecture out of coincidence. "Thank you for meeting me," he said. "I know this is strange." "Tell me about the medical gaps," I said. I needed to hear it in his own words, not the version I'd been constructing in my head. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "About 6 years ago, I came to in a hospital in Knoxville. No ID on me, no phone, nothing in my pockets but a pocket knife and a folded piece of paper with your phone number on it." He paused. "They told me I'd been found by a couple of hunters in the Cherokee National Forest, 6 or 7 miles from the park boundary. I was badly dehydrated, malnourished, some old healed fractures they couldn't date precisely. They estimated I'd been out there a long time. A long time. The wildfire had been 9 years ago. He'd been found 6 years ago. 3 years unaccounted for. Living in the forest, somehow, or somewhere. What did they determine about your identity?" I asked. "Nothing. John Doe. Eventually I worked with a social worker in Knoxville, got a new ID issued, picked a name. Ray felt right for reasons I can't explain. Larson was the social worker's last name. She was kind." He looked at me steadily. "I've been in Asheville for 4 years. I do finish carpentry. Custom furniture and restoration work, mostly." He glanced down at his hands, the way a craftsman sometimes does, involuntarily assessing his own tools. "I'm good at it. I don't know where I learned, but I've always known." "What kind of joinery work?" I asked, and I said it quiet and level, even though my chest felt like something was trying to push out through my sternum. He looked up. "What?" "Joinery. What methods do you prefer?" "Drawbore mortise and tenon, mostly. Some hand-cut dovetails." He paused. "Wedge through tenons, when the piece needs to breathe. It's an old method. Not many people bother with it anymore." I had taught Danny wedge through tenons the summer he was 19. I had learned the technique from my own father, who had learned it from his. It was not something you found in any standard woodworking manual. It was something passed from hand to hand, across generations in our family, and I had passed it to one person, my son, in a workshop behind a house in Sevierville, Tennessee. "Ray," I said, and my voice broke on that single syllable, which was not even his name. "I need to show you something." I had brought photographs. I'd spent the night before going through boxes in the back bedroom, the room I kept sealed most of the time because it held Carol's things and Danny's things, and a grief I could only visit for short periods before it became too large to manage. I had pulled out a specific photograph. Danny at 23, standing on the porch of the cabin on Ridgemont Road, holding a mug of coffee, laughing at something off camera. You could see his hands clearly, the particular way he held the mug with both hands, even in summer, which Carol always said meant he'd been born cold. I slid the photograph across the table. Ray looked at it. The color left his face like water draining from a glass. "Where did you get this?" he said. "I took it 9 years ago. That's my—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "That's the cabin. That's the porch." He put his finger on the figure in the photo, on the man holding the coffee mug. "This person, I know this person. I've seen this face before. In dreams. I thought it was myself. I thought I was seeing myself." He looked up at me and his gray-green eyes were wide and swimming. "Who is this?" "His name is Daniel Holt," I said. "He went by Danny. He was my son." I stopped, steadied myself. "He died in a wildfire in the Smoky Mountains 9 years ago. They found his wallet, a boot. Partial remains they were 92% certain were his." Ray said nothing. He looked back at the photograph. "You were born in 1986, I said. "In Sevierville. You weighed 8 pounds, 4 ounces, and you screamed so loud the whole maternity ward complained. Your mother named you Daniel because she said you had the face of someone who would survive anything." He was very still. "You had a broken jaw at 15. You sprained your right ankle at 20 and it never healed quite right. You could spend an entire afternoon sanding a single board and call it a good day's work. Your mother used to say you were born knowing the grain of wood, the way some people are born knowing music." "Stop," he whispered. He wasn't saying it to make me stop. He was saying it because the word was the only sound that came up. "I know," I said. "I know how this sounds. I sat in my kitchen for 2 nights, trying to talk myself out of it. I'm not going to tell you who you are. You're the only one who can do that, but I need you to know what I believe. And I need us to find out for certain." He put both hands flat on the table like he needed something solid. His hands were shaking slightly. "A DNA test," he said. "Yes." He nodded. One single motion, slow and deliberate. "Okay, yes, I need to know too." We left the diner together and drove separately to a hospital in Asheville that Ray knew, where a physician he trusted ran the necessary tests and explained that results would take 5 to 7 business days. We stood in the hospital parking lot afterward in the flat white light of a Tuesday afternoon, two men on either side of a question that neither of us could answer yet. "Can I?" He stopped, looked at the trees at the edge of the lot, started again. "Can I see the cabin?" "Before we know." "I know that's maybe a strange request." "It's not strange at all," I said. "You built it." We drove in convoy up toward Cock County, him behind me in a truck that was newer than mine, both of us winding up through the hills as the afternoon light went golden through the tree canopy. I turned onto Ridgemont Road and felt what I always felt when I made this turn, which was something between coming home and stepping into a wound. In my rearview mirror, I could see Ray's truck following, and that was the most surreal image of my life. Something I'd thought was behind me appearing in my rearview mirror. I pulled into the clearing and we both got out. Ray stood looking at the cabin for a long time without saying anything. I watched him. He was taking it in piece by piece, the way a person does when they are trying to match something exterior to something interior, when they are looking for the overlap between what they see and what they feel. He walked to the porch steps and stopped with one foot on the first step and his hand on the post. He ran his hand down the post slowly. His expression changed. "There's a repair here," he said. "Right at the base. The wood was replaced. The grain doesn't match perfectly." He looked at me. "Why?" "A black bear got into the porch the winter after we finished it," I said. "Danny spent a whole Saturday cutting out the damaged section and splicing in new wood. He was meticulous about matching the grain. Not meticulous enough, apparently." Ray stood there with his hand on that post and said nothing for almost a full minute. Then he walked up onto the porch and lowered himself into one of the rocking chairs, the same one Danny always sat in. I don't know whether he chose it by instinct or chance. I sat in the other one, the one I'd been sitting in for 9 years of Sunday mornings alone, and we sat together in those two chairs in the way we'd sat before, though he didn't remember it, and I was still not allowing myself to be certain. The woods breathed around us, a thrush somewhere back in the trees. "I smell something," he said. "Wood smoke and something underneath it, pine sap and something else." "I stain the porch boards every spring," I said. "Linseed oil and a cedar-based preservative." Danny mixed the formula, said the hardware store stuff was too thin. Ray's face did something complicated, like a door opening in a dark room, just a crack, letting in a sliver of something he couldn't name. "Tell me about him," he said quietly. "Tell me about Danny." So I did. I sat in my rocking chair in the August afternoon, and I told him everything I could hold in words. I told him about the boy who took every piece of scrap wood from my shop and made something with it before he could read, who at 6 built a birdhouse that was structurally sounder than most things an adult would make, who at 12 decided he was going to learn every species of tree in Tennessee by sight and smell, and achieved it by the end of summer. I told him about his mother, Carol, who had been the center of our small family, who got sick when Danny was 25 and fought the cancer for 2 years with a fierceness that still brings me to my knees when I think about it. I told him how after Carol died, Danny and I had become each other's whole family, the two of us spending long weekends at the cabin, talking into the nights about everything and nothing, the way men do when the only witness to their openness is the dark. I told him about the last morning I saw him. He'd been heading out for his solo hike, that annual trip he took every August. He came by the house the evening before to show me a new route he'd mapped. He was excited about it, one of those elevated energy states he got when he was about to be in the mountains. He left the next morning and I watched his truck go down the driveway, and I thought, that's my son going off into the world. I had no sense of it being the last time. I don't know if I should have, or if that's just a story I tell myself. 4 days later, the fire department called. Ray sat in his rocking chair and listened to all of it. Sometimes he closed his eyes, Sometimes he pressed his lips together in a way that was unmistakably, physically Danny's way of holding himself still when something was hitting him hard. Once he said very quietly, "The kitchen? Yellow walls." And I said, "That was Carol." She said it was the best light for cooking, and he got quiet again for a long time. We stayed on that porch until the sun dropped behind the ridge and the shadows came in. When it was fully dark, he said he should get back to Asheville. I walked him to his truck. "Whatever the test says," he said, "I want you to know that this felt—" He stopped, working for the word. "Real. This felt like something I was supposed to find. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," I said. I drove home alone. I sat in my kitchen in the house that had been too quiet for 9 years, and I did not feel alone. I'm not sure I can explain that precisely. Nothing had been confirmed. Everything was still uncertain. But something had shifted in the quality of the silence. The way a room changes when someone is standing just outside the closed door. The next 3 days were the longest of my life. Ray called once, in the evening of the second day, not to talk about anything specific, just to ask if I'd ever gotten the porch steps properly leveled, because they'd felt slightly off to him. I told him the left side had always been about a quarter-inch low because the ground settled, and I could never seem to get ahead of it. He said that made sense. We talked for 40 minutes about nothing at all, and it was the best 40 minutes I'd had in 9 years. On the 5th day, the hospital called. The genetic counselor, a soft-spoken man named Dr. Whitfield, asked me to come in. Ray was already there when I arrived, sitting in the waiting room with his forearms on his knees, staring at the floor. He looked up when I came in. Dr. Whitfield brought us into his office and opened a folder. He looked at both of us. "Mr. Holt," he said, "the results indicate a 99.97% probability of a first-degree biological relationship, specifically consistent with a father-son relationship. This is within the standard parameters for paternity confirmation." I heard the words. I had been waiting 9 years, maybe longer than that, for some version of these words, for some reassurance that the world I had understood to be true was in fact true, that the connections I'd built my life around were real and would hold. My son looked at me across that small office, this man who had been Ray Larson for 6 years, and before that a John Doe in a Knoxville hospital, and before that a lost man in a national forest, and before that the boy I raised, and his eyes were his mother's eyes. And he said, "Dad," just that one word. The first time he'd said it, and something that had been contracted in my chest for 9 years opened like a hand unclenching. I couldn't speak. I reached across and put my hand on the back of his neck, the way I used to when he was a teenager, and I was proud of him. The specific physical language of fathers and sons, and he dropped his head forward and his shoulders shook. We stayed like that for a long time, in that quiet office, while Dr. Whitfield found somewhere else to look. There were still questions. Of course there were. There are always still questions. The answers took months to piece together, partly through a private investigator I hired, a thorough and patient man named Bernard Cole who had worked cold cases for 30 years, and partly through the slow process of Danny's own fragmented returning memory. Here is what Bernard determined, as best he could reconstruct from fire department records, Park Service reports, and medical histories scattered across 3 counties. The wildfire on August 14th had been faster and more disorienting than anyone anticipated. Danny had been at a backcountry campsite in a section that was not yet under evacuation order when the wind shifted. He had run. The running itself was not the problem. The problem was a ravine he didn't know was there, obscured by smoke, that dropped 15 feet into a creek bed. He fell. The injuries were severe, head trauma most prominent among them, but the creek protected him from the fire that jumped over the ravine and continued east. He was not found for 3 days. When he was found, it was by 2 men from a rural community in the Cherokee National Forest on the North Carolina side of the park boundary, who brought him to their property and cared for him through a period that, in the accounting of injuries and recovery time, would have covered 3 months. They were older men, by all evidence well-meaning, who distrusted hospitals and had some experience with self-treatment. By the time Danny's condition stabilized enough for him to be mobile, he had no memory of who he was. He could walk, talk, work with his hands. He retained procedural knowledge and physical skills. He had lost the autobiographical architecture of his own life. The investigator's report for the fire listed his wallet, found near the ravine, and a boot found further east, carried by the wind or water. The partial remains identified as consistent with him came from a portion of the site where the fire had been hottest and had in all likelihood belonged to a deer or other animal. The medical examiner's office, understaffed and under pressure in the wake of a major fire event, had applied the identification it was already predisposed to expect. 92% certainty, 8% that had wandered for 3 years in the mountains and forests of eastern Tennessee and western North Carolina before emerging, half-starved and unknown, from the tree line into a pair of hunters' sight lines. 3 years. When I asked Danny about those 3 years, he told me what he could, which was fragments, images, the feel of seasons changing, the knowledge of how to survive in the forest that came to him out of some residual deep memory, the way his woodworking did, the way the roads of his body remembered things his mind had lost. He had tried in those years to locate some fixed point, some name or place that would tell him who he was. He found none. He found only the forest, and then eventually the way out of it. The piece of paper with my phone number, that he could not explain and neither could I. It had been with him, folded inside a woodworking notebook he'd had since before the accident, and it was possible he'd written it in the last hours before the hike, before he left, thinking something like, emergency contact, in case. He had been going into the backcountry alone. It was the kind of thing a careful person might do, but he didn't remember doing it, and I don't remember him telling me he'd done it. It was simply there, a bridge he'd built before the flood, that had held all those years waiting for the waters to recede. The logistics of everything that followed were complicated and slow, and I will spare you most of them. There were legal questions around his identity, resolved over time. There were medical evaluations, months of work with a neurologist who specialized in traumatic amnesia, and who told us, gently, that the missing years and memories might never fully return, that the brain protects itself sometimes by building walls that don't come down. There was the question of the grave in Sevierville with Danny's name on it and someone else's remains. We handled the last part carefully. Bernard tracked down what family Marcus Aldridge had left, which was not much. A younger sister in Chattanooga who had been told her brother died in an accident during a cross-country trip and had grieved him quietly for 9 years. Her name was Patricia, and when I called her I said only that new information had come to light regarding her brother's identification, and her voice on the phone was the voice of someone who had held a sorrow for a long time and was being asked to look at it again. We had Marcus Aldridge's remains properly identified and returned to his name. Patricia came with 2 of her children for the small service we held, and I stood at the edge of it and thought about 9 years of wrong names and how the earth holds whoever you give it regardless. Marcus Aldridge had a name again. That mattered. It mattered to me, and it clearly mattered to Patricia, who thanked me afterward with a directness that undid me entirely. Danny's headstone now reads, Daniel Holt, 1986. Not lost. Found. Danny, my son. He still goes by Ray sometimes. That's the name he built a life with. The name attached to the skills and the relationships and the 4 years in Asheville. And a name is not nothing when it's the one you chose yourself from the rubble of a self you couldn't remember. But he lets me call him Danny when it's just the 2 of us. And I'll take that. I'll take it and hold it like the gift it is. He moved back to Tennessee 4 months after the DNA results, not into my house immediately. He got an apartment in Sevierville, which felt right, close enough to rebuild something without collapsing the space between us too fast. He started his own furniture restoration business in town. He does wedged-through tenons and hand-cut dovetails, and the particular linseed and cedar oil treatment that he invented himself without remembering he invented it, and his clients don't fully understand why his work looks the way it does, only that it does. On Sunday mornings, he comes to the house. I make the French press coffee Carol taught me to make back in 1991, dark and strong, and Danny holds the mug with both hands the way he always did, and we sit at the kitchen table and I tell him stories about who he was. He doesn't always remember the events I describe. Occasionally, something will surface in his expression, a shimmer of recognition, there and then gone. The neurologist told us to think of it less like a locked door and more like a palimpsest. Layers of experience written over each other. The earlier ones faint but still there, potentially readable with enough time and patience. 2 months ago, we went back to the cabin together to do some repair work on the porch. The railing had loosened over the winter. We spent a Saturday pulling boards and resetting anchors, and Danny worked with the particular focused silence that was always his way with wood, and I worked alongside him the way I had done when he was 17, and the cabin was just a concrete foundation and a dream. Around mid-afternoon, he set down his chisel and looked at the tree line for a while. "I built this," he said. It was not a question. It was a man locating himself in something, feeling the alignment of what he knew in his hands and what he was beginning to know in his mind. "We built it," I said. He nodded and picked up his chisel and kept working. In the evenings, sometimes we sit on the porch in those 2 rocking chairs, and I don't say much, and neither does he. And the woods do what the woods do, which is breathe and settle and go dark in increments. There's a screech owl that's been working the same territory for 3 years. Danny noticed it the second time he came out here, and he's been tracking its pattern since. The way he tracked things in the forest for the 3 years he was lost there, the way a person orients himself when he has nothing else to go by. He asked me once, in a quiet moment, whether I was angry. Angry at the fire department, at the medical examiner, at whatever chain of understaffed and overwhelmed and imperfect institutions had looked at the evidence and arrived at the wrong answer. I thought about that for a while before I answered, which is the honest way to treat a real question. "I was," I said. "For a while after we found out, I was very angry. I sat with it for some time. I looked at the tree line. But I spent 9 years being angry at a world that had taken my son. And now my son is here. The same amount of anger in the same chest. But now there's also this. I decided the anger could find somewhere smaller to live." Danny was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That sounds like something someone wise would say. Your mother would have said it better." He smiled at that. He doesn't remember Carol, not in any retrievable narrative way. But when I talk about her, he gets an expression I've come to recognize, which is something between recognition and longing, the feeling of reaching for something that was yours. I tell him about her every chance I get. I tell him she was funnier than both of us combined, that she could read a room in 3 seconds and calibrate herself to exactly what it needed, that she smelled like the lemon verbena soap she ordered from a company in Vermont, that she died in March when the redbuds were blooming, and I've never looked at a redbud since without feeling her in it. "She would have loved seeing you back," I told him once. She would have been furious at the parts that went wrong. She would have cried until she had nothing left. And then she would have made a pot of soup and told you to eat something because you looked thin. He laughed at that. It was too loud for the size of the porch, that laugh. The screech owl went quiet for a moment in the trees. It's been almost a year now since that voicemail. Since a stranger's voice came out of my phone at 11:47 on a Wednesday night and said 17 words that broke the floor of the last 9 years of my life and let me fall through to something I had stopped believing was underneath. People ask me sometimes how I am. They want to know if it's surreal, living with a relationship that had to be rebuilt from the outside in, a son who knows the fact of who he is without holding the memories of it. They want to know if it's strange that he calls me by my first name most of the time. They want to know, gently, with all the kindness of people who are trying to understand something too large for the usual frameworks, whether this is what I hoped for. Here is what I tell them. I tell them that hope is a dangerous thing to nurse for 9 years. It either breaks you or it changes shape, turns into something tougher and less beautiful, more like a habit of believing than a feeling you can locate. I had the habit. I kept paying the cell phone bill that used to be Danny's, which is the kind of irrational thing grief makes you do. And I kept driving up that dirt road on Ridgemont Road and sitting in a rocking chair I had built with my son and talking to the trees. And one night a stranger called and asked about the cabin, and the stranger's voice had the cadence of a man who learned to talk from his mother, and the stranger's hands knew wedged through tenons without being taught, and the stranger's eyes were the gray-green of a woman I loved for 32 years. It is not the same as what we had. I want to be honest about that. The 28 years of a childhood and a young adulthood and a friendship between a father and a son, those years exist now only in me. I carry them alone. Danny carries a different version of his own history, fragments and muscle memory, and the cabin on Ridgemont Road, which he knows in his hands more than in his mind. But there are Sunday mornings. There is coffee and the particular silence of two people who don't need to fill the space between them. There is a porch with 2 rocking chairs and a screech owl in the territory it has claimed. There is my son, alive, building furniture in a shop in Sevierville and smelling of linseed oil and cedar, and sometimes in the evenings he calls me and doesn't say much, just wants to talk about some problem he's working on with a piece of figured walnut, or whether I've noticed the weather turning or what I'm making for dinner. Last week he came out to the cabin on a Tuesday afternoon, which was not our usual arrangement. He just appeared at the end of Ridgemont Road in his truck and got out and said he'd been in the area for a delivery and thought he'd stop by. We ended up sitting on the porch until well past dark. He fell asleep in his rocking chair around 9 o'clock, the way he used to fall asleep in chairs when he was a teenager, completely and immediately, like sleep was a country he could enter at will. I sat in the dark and looked at my son's sleeping face, older than I'd last seen it, bearded and weathered in new ways, and I thought, this is what it means to be given something back. Not the same version, not the unbroken original, but the living person who contains everything that person was, carrying it in his hands and his habits and his gray-green eyes, finding his way back to it in pieces. I didn't put a roof over that cabin wrong. I didn't set a level wrong. The windows are straight. The railing will hold now that we've reset the anchors. The wood is good. My son is alive. He's asleep in a rocking chair, 12 feet from me, and the night is warm, and the owl is working its territory in the dark, and I am 64 years old, and I have been given back something I had no right to expect. It is more than enough. It is everything.